Greetings citizens of the world. A very sobering Ministry of Defense (MOD) report circulating in the Kremlin today states that at 1030 hours, GMT plus 3:0230 hours, GMT-5, Washington, D.C., the United States Department of State, DOS, initiated the June 20, 1963 hotline agreement, last used by President Barack Obama in October 2016, to inform the Federation of Russia that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, aka North Korea, was in violation of the July 27, 1953 Armistice Agreement for the restoration of the South Korean state, and as this is an act of war, President Donald Trump is preparing to invoke the Proliferation Strategy Initiative, PSI, to respond against, and with Russia being one of the 105 member nations signing the PSI agreement, means the Federation will now have to defend America. According to this report, the Armistice Agreement for the restoration of the South Korean state was signed on July 27, 1953 to establish a complete cessation of all hostilities in Korea by all armed forces that was to be enforced by the commanders of both sides. Essentially a complete ceasefire was put into force, but with the armistice only being a ceasefire between military forces, rather than an agreement between governments, as no peace treaty was ever signed, which means that the Korean War has not officially ended. In the armistice violation document prepared by the U.S. Department of State against North Korea, this report details, the Americans state that on November 13, 2017, a North Korean defector crossed the Joint Security Area, JSA Panmunjom of the demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea and was fired upon by North Korean border guards, with the defector being gravely wounded and South Korean Defense Minister Song Young-moo testifying that this was the first time since 1953 that North Korea had fired into the Joint Security Area. On 20th of November, this report continues, President Trump received a report from the United Nations Command, UNC, stating that their investigation found the North Koreans had, indeed, violated the 1953 armistice by firing across the border into the Joint Security Area, and in one case briefly crossing it in pursuit of their soldier who was defecting, and that Trump immediately responded to, within hours, by his designating North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. Beginning on 22nd of November, this report says, this U.S. State Department armistice violation document asserts that the United Nations Command read it charges to North Korea asking them to explain their actions, but who refused all contact, and as exampled by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Daniel McShane, of the UNC Military Armistice Commission, who made requests for a meeting 6 times in both languages to North Korean guards on the other side of the military demarcation line, MDL, and who said, "We did it through the bullhorn and the rain." To my knowledge they haven't acknowledged this event at all other than the initial firing. Commander McShane and his translator initially read the UNC's charges to the North Korean soldiers 3 times, this report notes, then went inside their MDL command building, but the North Koreans signaled with a flashlight that they wanted a repeat for video, so Commander McShane and his translator went outside again and repeated the message 3 more times, with his stating, "We were about 30 feet from the MDL and they came up to 10 feet with Commander McShane," also, adding that's the usual mode of communicating with the North Koreans since that communist state suspended use of a hotline. "We have a phone in our office, but they're not answering." On 29th of November, though, this report grimly states, North Korea did, in fact, finally respond to the UNC not with words, but by their firing of a new type of Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, capable of traveling over 13,000 kilometers, 8,000 miles, and now believed to be able to carry multiple warheads, thus endangering the entirety of the United States. The Security Council, SC, in responding to the U.S. Department of State notification that President Trump was preparing to invoke the Proliferation Strategy Initiative against North Korea, this report notes, is now warning that the world is closer to war and who solemnly added, "We are making calculations, preparations. It will not be a surprise to us." As to why President Trump's invoking the Proliferation Strategy initiative brings the world closer to war, this report explains, is that it would mean the interdiction of all North Korean ships on the high seas, thus, in effect, establishing an international blockade of North Korea, and that, just weeks ago, Trump prepared a United Nations resolution to bring into effect. With the leftist forces in America now claiming that it's illegal for President Trump to attack North Korea, though, this report continues, Trump's UN ambassador Nikki Haley forcefully slammed them down this past week by her forcefully declaring to the entire world, if war comes, make no mistake, the North Korean regime will be utterly destroyed. As to why President Trump has chosen to confront North Korea with a Proliferation Strategy initiative blockade, this report explains, began to come into formation 2 days when China refused to Trump's request to send the North Korean defector's family to South Korea, with China, instead, sending his young wife and child back to North Korea where they will, without a doubt, be subjected to torture and death, as North Korea deems the entire families of defectors to all be traitors. President Trump's anger over China's refusal to save the life of the North Korean defector's wife and child, this report continues, embroiled his entire White House, with one faction calling for the immediate sanctions of all Chinese banks doing business with North Korea, with their pointing out that while the U.S. has imposed some $12 billion in fines for European banks that laundered money for Iran, they have not put a single penny in fines on Chinese banks that launder for North Korea, but who are opposed by what is called the Goldman Bank supporters, who claim that any sanctions on Chinese banks doing business with North Korea would hurt the global economy. Siding with the Goldman Bank supporters not wanting sanctions on Chinese banks, this report details, is Trump's Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, but whom new reports are now stating has been given a death blow by Trump, who plans to remove him as soon as possible, and Trump choosing the middle option between these two warring White House factions by his choosing the super sanctions route provided him by the Proliferation Strategy initiative, that was first established by the President George W. Bush regime, and has, likewise, been strongly supported by President Obama, too. With new satellite photos showing North Korea rapidly building a massive new launch pad from which to fire its nuclear missiles from, this report concludes, President Trump's invoking of a Proliferation Strategy initiative blockade obliges Russia to aid the Americans, and is why elite Marine Infantry forces are now being rushed to the Russian-North Korea border as fears of World War III grow, and whose mission will be to invade North Korea in order to stop a nuclear apocalypse.